moment, and I know a lot of you in the same boat, so I appreciate you making the effort to come out this evening. So I'll welcome the ministers. Which one would like to go first? Minister O'Connor.
Look, kia ora, and thank you very much, David. I'll acknowledge Andrew. Joe Luxton's here as well. Joe, my mate David Parker, all the officials. Look, thanks very much, and it's great to be here. I was at Greymouth a couple of nights ago and at the Water Forum, and I guess I'm here to listen, but I'd like to just lay out some of the Greymouth. I just had to, for the record, say that just as I left Wellington, I've got a couple of daughters live up there, and they said, Dad, be nice to the people down there. We've got lots of friends down there. I said, well, as long as they reciprocate. Look, it's good to be down here, and I know a lot of you in the room, and I know this is of concern to you. Very aware of the pressure on farming, and it has been there for quite some time, and I guess you'll say that the uncertainty around some of these things may have brought a bit more pressure. We acknowledge that. There's always some challenge out in the rural sector. But to be fair, we've been straight up and honest on this issue of water since before the election. And some of you might have been at a meeting, pretty raucous meeting in Ashburton. And to acknowledge my mate David Parker, David's always been up front and said, we've got to address this water issue. In fact, Fonterra acknowledged that probably 10 years ago, that we've got some challenges because of the growth and the quantum of the nitrates going on the soil. We're not quite sure what's happening. When I was milking, most of the shit went out the creek and down into the river, and we didn't do much. My brother now has, I think, 3 effluent ponds, has a far better management system, and that story would pretty much be replicated right across the country. A huge amount of good work going on. But what we have seen in some areas is indicators of nitrates going up and of water quality going down. Not just nitrates. And so it is better that we front to that issue and address it sooner rather than later. Because if we don't, it's going to cost us a hell of a lot more. The social licence to operate as an agricultural sector must always be maintained. There are concerns by people who don't know how we run our farm systems around animal welfare, around labour management, around environmental impact. So we do have a challenge now in a country that is mostly urban. They're really busy, people living their lives. They don't have the time to necessarily come out and find out more about how we run operations on farms. The way that most farmers operate now is hugely different to what it was in the 80s, even in the 90s. We have made progress through technology, but that technology has also given us knowledge. And some of that knowledge is around water quality that says things are going down in some areas. And so we should take stock and try and turn that around. This is a discussion document. There's been lots of speculation, lots of political grandstanding, lots of statements made about what this is. There is no preconceived solution here. These are proposals, and the proposals will work through in a pretty robust way in Wellington. But like most things in Wellington, we don't get them perfect. And what we are doing through these series of meetings throughout the country is listening to what are genuine opinions and knowledge and local feedback. The actions on the West Coast will be quite different from what is required here in South Canterbury and in Southland and up in the Waikato. A lot of you have been involved through ECAN with initiatives to try and improve water quality, and thank you, and I'm sure that ECAN have been doing a good job. But what we've said is that we're taking stock of where those things are at. Not every regional council in the country is quite as well equipped or has as much knowledge as they do, and so they need to come up to speed as well. So we're here to listen, happy to answer any questions. Thank you very, very much for turning up. It is important. In terms of the issue of submissions, write down your views on any one particular part of it, 1 pager, half a page, and send it in. That is a submission that will be read and genuinely considered. That's what we're trying to do here. You do not have to, because it was asked of me in Greymouth, how do we go through, do the assessment on what our impacts are from our farm, and then write a submission. We don't want farm plans. We want your ideas and your concerns fed back into the system. So thank you very, very much for coming. I'll just now introduce my mate and colleague, David Parker. Kia ora.
Thanks, Damien. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. I'm not going to take too much of your time because I think you probably want to hear a more detailed description of the proposals and then have the opportunity to ask questions. I would say that from my perspective, we've essentially got three objectives. We want to stop it getting worse. We want to turn it around so that we can see some overall improvements within 5 years. And then we want to set the course for improvements over the following generation. The stopping it getting worse stuff, which will be described in detail by Brian, essentially tries to stop the quantity of the stuff that is problematic growing larger. So that the cleanup problem doesn't get bigger. Our view is that if we allow the quantity of the risky practices to get larger, then the cost on incumbents, as well as those who are increasing that quantity, in the future will be higher, and that's in no one's interest, and it'll be harder to fix up. There are some incorrect assertions out there that we want all this done by 2025. That's not correct. That's the forward date from which the proposed national policy statement works. It's not the date by which things get back to where we want them to get. There's also a suggestion that we somehow want to get to pristine waterways that are pure. Those are some of the adjectives that have been used, which again is not correct. We're not trying to return New Zealand to some nirvana where you can have water that's clean enough to drink, or is like it was before we had cities and farms. We're not. But we do want to get something closer to what we had in the early 1990s, when more of our waterways were swimmable. I think that's all about I'll say here. Just in respect of the nitrogen attribute that is causing angst around here, the proposal in this discussion document, and it is a discussion document, it's not a finite set of proposals that we're just going to ram through. The indicator of 1 is already met by the Ashburton River. I'm going to hand over to Brian.
Thanks, Ministers, and I'll just add my welcome to all. We know you're incredibly busy people, and we really appreciate you being here. So my job is to just take you through the detail of what the package proposes, and I'll start by telling you what it doesn't do, actually. For those who have already heard this afternoon at this afternoon's sessions, my most humble apologies for having to listen to my voice droning on again. So, as ministers have just pointed out, I'll just see if I can make this thing work properly. Here we go. When this thing kicked off in October of last year, the government formed an Essential Freshwater Task Force, and they laid out 3 key high-level objectives. Mr. Parker just talked about those. The first was to stop things getting worse, no more further degradation of waterways, and to make material improvement within 5 years. The second was to reverse the past damage and get ourselves back to a good, healthy waterways within a generation. And I think within a generation is important here because it implies that the government understands that it has taken a long time to get to this point, and it is going to take some time to get back to, I think, where most New Zealanders want to be. And the third objective is to address allocation or fair allocation. Now, this package very much focuses on the first 2 of those objectives. It does not address the issues of allocation. Allocation, of course, is once you've set a kind of environmental limit, who gets to use the resources within that limit? And that's a really critical, really fraught, really difficult conversation. Councils have certainly struggled with it, and you may have heard of the Waitangi Tribunal Y2358, which came out a couple of weeks ago, and it made recommendations around issues about allocation. Those are complex, they need to be addressed. There is a treaty partnership element tied up to those, but they are not the subject of this package. This package very much focuses on water quality and getting water quality measures in place. The package covers everything. It is not a town or rural package. The proposed national policy statement, which I'll talk about in a minute, doesn't mention rural and urban. It applies everywhere. If I am a developer in Auckland, then the sediment controls or the sediment proposals will apply to me just as much as they would to a hill country farmer in the Wairarapa. And it has been developed by a multi-disciplinary task force, and there were 4 advisory groups set up. I won't spend too much time on this, but the Kahui Wai Māori was an advisory group to the government. It wasn't a negotiating group. It was advising ministers on the Māori position on freshwater. The Freshwater Leaders Group, which John Penno here tonight was the chair of, and that had about a third farming expertise, a third farmers represented on that Freshwater Leaders Group. The Science and Technical Advisory Group, Ken Taylor's here tonight, he was the chair of the Science and Technical Advisory Group. And then there was a regional council subgroup to make sure that the proposals fitted in with where regional councils were heading. Okay, so I've talked about what the package isn't. Let's talk about what it is. So there are 6 main bits to this package, and they're all important. The first is the current rulemaking process isn't that flash. It's long, it's expensive, it can be litigious, and so the government's proposing to introduce a new streamlined plan-making process, and it goes something like this. Regional councils will still be responsible for working with their communities, working with you, to develop regional plans, proposed regional plans. But at the hearing stage, there will be an independent advisory panel, which is made up of 5 members, and it's proposed those members would be 2 appointed from the Crown, 2 appointed by the Regional Council, and 1 nominated by tangata whenua. That expert panel would take over the hearings stage of the regional plan development. When it makes recommendations, it will report back to the council. If the council accepts those recommendations, then that will be it. The deal will be done, and there'll be no de novo appeals except on points of law to the High Court. All right. So this is modelled on the regime that was used in Auckland, and it's quite similar to the regime that you've had here in Canterbury. And it does a few things. Firstly, it allows the process to move faster. And as Mr. Parker has already said, 2025 is when the government wants to have these plans in place, which means about 2023 is when proposed plans need to be in place. The second thing it does is bring more national consistency to the process. All right? So that is a really significant part of this package. The second bit of this package is about raising the bar on ecological outcomes, and this is through a national policy statement. Now, there are 4 big bits to this proposed national policy statement. The first is the core concept is te mana o te wai. Now, te mana o te wai means a lot of things to a lot of people, but in this context, te mana o te wai means that you have to think of the rivers holistically, or the waterways holistically, that tangata whenua have a substantive role in here, and that the councils will need to lay out a long-term vision for what they want their waters to be. That long-term vision needs to put the quality of the water or the modi of the water first. So the hierarchy goes, first comes the water, then comes the essential needs of people, and then comes all the other things we want to do with water. Now, as Mr. Parker pointed out, the government is not proposing te mana o te wai means pristine, or somehow we're going to get back to, utopia. It doesn't, but it does mean that instead of, when we think about the long-term value, the long-term outcomes we're looking for, it's not a trade-off necessarily between that versus that, It's the water first, and then all the other uses that we have for water. So that's the first big bit. The second bit is we've taken a much broader ecological approach. So you know that there was a nitrogen value or there was a phosphorus value in the old national policy statement, or you may not know that, but if you don't, that's the way it worked. This looks at a lot more broader kind of environmental or ecosystem outcomes, like what are the fish stocks in the rivers? What's the macroinvertebrate population in the rivers, as well as all those other things about nutrients, etc. One big bit that wasn't in the last policy statement was sediment, and there were recommendations, and have been recommendations made for a long time, that there should be a series of attributes, or that's what we, outcomes or bottom lines to do with sediment. So this package proposes a new sediment outcome. In fact, it proposes two. They are not going to be that easy to achieve. They, in some places, are pretty tough. But our modelling shows that they can be achieved through good whole farm management. Our modelling shows that they don't require the wholesale conversion of farms to something like plantation forestry. It's probably a lot more significant issue in the North Island than it is down here, because the North Island rivers, frankly, carry a lot more sediment. The next proposal, which is really significant, is swimming, and the government's proposing that people should be able to swim when and where they want to. And so there's a new set of bottom lines about swimming. Now, councils will identify swimming sites, and then the water quality in those swimming sites needs to meet the new bottom lines. So that again, is a significant issue, a significant change, and it won't be easy to achieve. But I just stress again the point that ministers have made. Nothing in this national policy statement sets a deadline for when these things have to be achieved, all right? That is an issue for councils working with their communities to lay out a time frame for when they want these bottom lines to be achieved. It's not 2025. It could be a significant time beyond that, a generation, possibly more. Then we get to this nitrogen attribute table, which I know has caused a lot of comment and concern particularly in Canterbury and Southland. So, bear with me for just a minute. The nitrogen proposal, firstly, the government has not said this is its preferred position. The government has received advice from the Science and Technical Advisory Group that there are rivers in New Zealand that aren't covered by the current framework for managing nitrogen in the National Policy Statement. And the advice from the Technical Advisory Group was that it should be covered, and this was the proposal that was made to the government by the STAG, the Science and Technical Advisors. And it was endorsed by both Kahui Waimāori and the Freshwater Leaders Group. The Regional Council Group didn't quite go that far with respect to this table. The table sets a possible new standard for water of 1 milligram per litre of water. And in those rivers where the existing nitrogen controls don't apply, the default at this stage would be a toxicity proposal, or just toxicity level, which is 6.9 milligrams per litre of water. So this is quite a different framework. But what I would say is that this only applies, or really makes a difference, in rivers that have a soft bottom. In rivers that have a stony bottom, the measure that's currently in the current NPS, and has been there since 2014, is the periphyton table. It's slime, right? And it grows because of fertiliser. The more fertiliser you put on, the more slime you get. It also is affected by temperature and water flows and things like that. That is actually covers more water and more area and can be tougher than the proposal or the possible nitrogen attribute table. All right. So apologies. That's a little technical, but it is important to kind of get your heads around. And then my last bullet point there is to reiterate again that councils working with communities set the timelines for when these bottom lines would be achieved. And I would also just reinforce the Minister's point that they made before, that the government is open to a range of options around this nitrogen attribute table. Okay. I won't spend much time on this because I know you want to get to questions real quick, but just to make the point that there are a third part of this package, this overall package, is to do with urban urban environments, and particularly wastewater operators and stormwater operators. And we've heard all over the country that people aren't very happy with how some of these things have performed, and they're not very happy about the level of transparency about what's going on, and particularly in stormwater and overflows. So there are a series of proposals in here that would create both a new national environmental standard for wastewater, which would cover what's coming out of the pipe, as well as clarifying what councils have to report on. And then another proposal in here is that all wastewater and stormwater operators would need to have a risk management plan that would lay out what's going on what's happening to the environment, what risks they're creating, and then a plan for sorting out those risks over a period of time. And that plan would need to be signed off by a recognised third party, and it would need to be audited and reported against. So as I say, I won't spend any more time on the urban stuff, but I do think it's important that you kind of get the sense that this is a comprehensive plan. The next bit, number 4, and you'll have heard a lot about this too, being where we are. And this is a series of proposed practice standards around the agricultural sector, okay? There are 2 big bits to this. The 2 most significant bits to this are, first, the proposal that every commercial farm would require a freshwater module of a farm environment plan, would require a farm environment plan that deals with how to mitigate the effects of that farm on waterways. That would need to be signed off by a recognised third party, a certified third party, and it would need to be audited, all right? And it would be a living plan. Now, there are lots of these plans in place, and frankly, Canterbury's already moved quite a long way along this line, and Waikato's moved a long way along this way as well. And so we'd start with what's there. We're not going to chuck out stuff that's already been done. We would start with what's there, and we would build on what's there. We'd also, when it comes to things like, what are the practice standards that are going to apply? How is somebody going to make a decision in these farm plans? We'd start with the material that sector groups have already put together, because there is some fantastic material out there that is, or practice guidance that's already there, okay? The other really big bit that you've probably heard quite a bit about is the stock exclusion proposals. So there was a series of stock exclusion proposals that were prepared by the previous government, and for various reasons they didn't proceed. But this government in its package has got some stock exclusion proposals as well. Now, a couple of things about those. Firstly, we're proposing to map lowland and rolling country, and the mandatory stock exclusion proposals would only apply in flat and rolling country, okay? There isn't a couple of exceptions to that. If you've got a very intensive hill country property, or you're running dairy cattle on a hill country property, then they would need to be stock excluded as well. All streams more than 1 metre would need to have stock exclusion, and the proposal is that there needs to be a minimum setback of 5 metres either side of the stream, average across the property, all right? There's also a proposal that if you're closer than 5 metres, then over a period of time, 15 years, you would need to move that fence back. Now, we've heard a great deal of commentary about that, and we expect a great deal of commentary from you guys as well. There are also some specific controls on some high-risk activities like winter grazing, or winter grazing of forage crops. They are kind of minimum standards. And if you want to go beyond those minimum standards and various thresholds, then you'd need to get a resource consent to do that. I won't spend too much time on that because we will get really bogged down in some very specific detail, but it is covered in the discussion document, including the kind of options that we are consulting on. There's also proposals in here that would, in the short term, start to limit nitrogen use immediately. And there are 3 options on the table, but the one I'll focus on is you would get a cohort of farmers in a similar area, similar farmers. You would get an overseer number out of those groups of farmers, and most of you will probably have one, of course, being where you are. And then you'd look at where the top 25% or 10% of discharges were, and you'd require them to move back to that threshold of, say, the top top 10% or the top 25% over 5 years. So you kind of pick off that really high level use of nitrogen. You say, you know what, that's got to change in the short term. Now that's a proposal. It's reasonably complex to implement. So we're still kind of thinking about how that would operate. And then the last one, which will be really interesting to you guys, is there was a proposal for mandatory telemetry of all significant water takes. I think it's over 5 litres per second. So that would be moving to mandatory telemetry over a period of time, unless of course you can't get internet coverage, and then it would have to be using the old process. Okay, apologies, I know this is an awful lot of material in a short period of time, but even with the best will in the world, it's going to take some time to put, for councils to put plans in place. And you remember the government made it pretty clear that it doesn't want things to get worse. And so it is proposing some interim controls, particularly on land use change, until councils get their plans in place. So until 2025. Now this ECAN already has a number of these high-level controls. So we'd need to work through whether or not these proposals would even apply in Canterbury. But for councils that don't have controls over total nutrient and sediment discharge, then the proposal is to limit or to control conversion to dairy. So no more conversions to dairy without a resource consent. Expansion of irrigation, expansion of vegetable growing, conversion of forestry to pasture. Have I missed any? I think that's it. Sorry. I think that's it. Now, these aren't absolute controls, right? And they are temporary controls. And they are there to stop things getting worse, because after all, if we do get more over allocation, overuse, then it's just going to make it harder for everybody to move back to whatever a new sustainable limit is. There's two other things about holding the line too, which aren't interim, and that is, first, no more loss of wetlands. The proposal is that essentially the clearance or destruction of wetlands would not be allowed to happen. And second, no more destruction of streams, which is particularly relevant to urban development for housing, for example, where piping of streams or diversion of streams is quite common. All right, so that's the kind of holding the line bits of this package. And then the last bit of this package is a support package that the government voted in Budget 19. So there was 229 million voted in Budget 19. A reasonable chunk of that is going to climate change work, but by far the lion's share of that is for sustainable land and to assist this process and this transition that we need to go through. And it's for things like supporting extension services for farmers, building some of the science and technology that you need in order to identify solutions, developing overseer, which I'm sure you've heard quite a bit and probably have quite a few clearly held views about, and also supporting councils to implement some of these measures. And then the final thing I'd say is that in terms of other government support, there are other government support arrangements in place. The Billion Trees program does have a partnerships component, which from memory is about $130 million. And that can be used, for example, by regional councils asking for partnership funding in order to help farmers with riparian management, fencing, retirement of highly erodible land, or tree planting in order to stabilise land, those sorts of things. Okay, so it's not all just conversion or all planting forest. It does include fencing and riparian management as a potential thing that the government can provide funding support for. So I won't bother with those unless you really want to. We can get into those in some more specific detail. The final thing I'd say is that this is part of further work, and there is further work to come in this area. Minister Parker has initiated a broader reform of the Resource Management Act, and some of these issues are wrapped up in there. There's further system issues like central oversight and funding the system and the science system that supports this, addressing Māori rights and interests, and further work on allocation, particularly starting with allocation of nitrogen, which of course is of intense interest to the people in this room. So that's me. Thank you.
Just before we take questions, I'll just ask John Pino, who's the chair of the Freshwater Committee, just to hop up here for 5 minutes and just to say a few words as well. Then we'll move on to questions, and we'll get Brian back up here to direct the questions.
All right. Evening, everybody. Look, the role that I had was chairing this group that they called the Freshwater Leaders Group. As you've heard, a third of them were farmers. And I guess everybody around the room were deeply passionate about water issues, and on most matters we agreed. There was a lot of agreement around the room. The number one agreement is that we do need to move. It's time to start addressing these issues and moving forward. The second thing is that we talked about a lot during the process is that this is not new. You've already heard tonight that this is actually an amendment to regulation that's been in place for some time. And the thing that I realised sitting there looking at what had happened in the last 10 years is that a lot of what we do need to face in our regions and the changes that we need to make have been put in place over time as people have looked to address these things over quite a long period of time. A lot of that came out of a very consultative process called the Land and Water Forum. The Land and Water Forum has gone for 10 years, went for 10 years. It had industry groups, it had NGOs, it had government around the table, and again, there were many, they didn't agree about everything, but there were a lot of things that they did agree on. And those of you who are deeply interested in this, I'd suggest going back and look. There was a key report in May last year, which was written at the end of that process, which sort of highlights some of the key things that they were suggesting together needed to get on with. There's two elements that I'd draw, that I'd just make observations about. The first is this issue of nitrate and what is there in the national policy statement or proposed national policy statement in this level of 1. Ken was the chairman of the technical advisory group, and he may choose to comment on this, but there was a group of 14 scientists there, and they were asked to put some scientific measures on what good looks like. Now, and again, I think that we're often talking past each other. To me, good looks like water bodies that have healthy ecosystems in them. Not pristine, not drinkable, but the things that should be there are there and are thriving, and the things that are not there or should not be there aren't there. And which I'd challenge, I guess, later on anyone in the room who would like to challenge that concept, because I think that most of us agree around that we want to get to a stage where we do have healthy ecosystems, healthy water bodies around the farms that we operate in the communities that we work in. Just because we're setting a national standard, though, and I think that this is the thing that really does need to be thought about, doesn't mean there won't be exceptions where actually it just doesn't make sense to try and get there. And we need to think about how we might manage those exceptions without giving away the principle that we actually want healthy water and healthy ecosystems around the farms that we're operating. So that's the first thing I think that we need to think about. What I don't want to see, personally I would hate to see happen, is that we lower a national standard because of the exceptions. National standards should be where they should be. They should not be set by the exceptions that we all know are out there and that I'm sure we're going to talk about as the evening goes on. A second thing I'd say is there seems to be a lot of discussion around this point that it's going to be hard to develop our farms further or to change land use in particular over the next 5 years, this moratorium on intensification. There's no doubt that there will be losers in that. There will be people there who are planning to do things in the next 5 years that they're actually going to be stopped from doing. I think in in Canterbury there won't be much of it because the current ECAN rules probably have it pretty well locked down in the catchments where it needs to be. But across the country, no doubt that'll happen. There'll be farmers who are planning on doing things, and in the next 5 years they won't be able to, and that'll bring some economic loss to those people. But the vast majority of farmers are being protected by that. And the reason is that in catchments that are already over-allocated, the next conversion, or the place that comes out of trees and goes into irrigation or whatever might happen, is putting load into those catchments that as these new rules, not just in these MPSs, but the ones that have been put in place over the last 10 years come into being, we're all going to have to carry the cost of that. And so loading more, putting more load on already overstressed catchments at this moment in time, I don't think is the right thing to do. And I'm very supportive of those, and the group that I was leading is very supportive of taking a pause till we get the regional plans in place, and then the regions can go back to managing those things as they should in their regions. So I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions if appropriate as the evening goes on.
Thank you, Joel. Can everyone hear me down the back with this mic? Oh, up a bit. So what we'll do now, I'll get Brian to front the questions again. Brian, if you're happy to do that. When you ask a question, if you have a preference of who answers it, could you let Brian know and he'll direct it to the Minister or to John or to Ken? Is everyone quite clear on that? And please be respectful of the other people here that are wanting to ask a question as well, so don't hold the floor for too long. The other microphone is with Sarah, midway down the room, so if you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand or catch our eye, and we'll do our best to get right round everybody. If you could please say your name when you ask your question, that would be greatly appreciated. Who would like to start?
I've got one down the back.
Okay, we've got one up here first, Sarah.
Thank you. You might have got the impression that we're feeling a bit under siege at the moment. It's a bit like drinking out of a fire hose, but we do have to do this. But I do note that the documents don't address the issue of groundwater. Most of our surface waters down here are in actually not bad condition. Our groundwater are in a serious, dreadful state, and a lot of people and a lot of potable water comes from the groundwater, and a lot of our farmers are reliant on groundwater as well. And I don't see that mentioned here at all. Is there a reason for that?
No, it does apply to groundwater. So these measures, these thresholds would apply to groundwater as well as surface water. I'm pretty sure that's right. I hope that's right. Can somebody correct me if I'm wrong? Great.
Thank you. Question down the back with Sarah.
Just going there now.
Jeffrey Pearce, a Deer Farmer. Thank you. If I may address this to either minister, but just a working example, we'll call him Farmer X, who's very conscientious. He's a deer farmer, and he wants to go along with proposed recommendations. So he has a creek through his property, kilometre long. He fences that. At a kilometre, he's lost a hectare at $25,000. The deer fence, both sides, 2 kilometre fencing, $30,000, $55,000 cost. To meet the one unit of N loading, 1 milligram, he decides to cut a stocking rate by half, which is the only way the model works. So he does that. And of course, the following day, he decides to check his mail. He's a bit grumpy because during the night he had to get up to shift his heifers. He grazes a few dairy heifers. It was wet in the night. He didn't want to pug the paddock. But anyway, he opens the mail and he gets the letter from his water quality test of his farm stream. And he's quite elated. He looks at the nitrate level from the Hill Laboratory and he says he has a level of 1. So you can see it's all been worthwhile. Sadly, he reads further down and it comes to E. coli. And E. coli levels are off the planet. And of course, there's an explanatory note saying how unsuitable the water is. But the effect here is wildlife. And of course, as we enhance all these waterways, the bird life is going to be quite an issue and have a great effect. So my question really is, where's the progress been for this farmer having gone through the ringer?
I'm sure Brian or Ken can answer this better than me, but natural effects like birds aren't a problem for you because they're excluded. The alternative would be that we include them. Who wants that? Well, I mean, that was the example that was just given by the gentleman deer farmer, saying that if they were included, it would be unfair to him, and I agree.
Question for... Question for Minister Parker. Jane Smith, North Otago Sheep and Beef Farmer. Just interested in who will shoulder the burden for the extra layer of bureaucrats to be able to audit these extra, requirements. Surely it seems unfair for that to sit squarely with the ratepayers within individual councils. Are we able to cover that through Crown funds or the Fish and Game Slush Fund or something like that? It just seems really unfair to burden ratepayers with this and the resourcing of it.
Look, it's a fair point, and I guess depending on who you're supplying, you'll probably have to have some assurance system on your farm, and there'll be some auditing of that. What we have been doing at MPI is to try and to round up all the requirements that farmers are facing now. Health and safety, biosecurity. Unfortunately, we're learning a bit about that. Animal welfare, there's a new focus on it. Then we've got overseer, then we've got freshwater plans like this. Yes, they are requirements. And I've been honest with farmers all the way saying, yes, they are a kind of cost of business, but actually they're a necessary component of business these days, given that what we're producing is supposed to be, and is for the most part, the highest quality protein and fibre for some very discerning markets. Whether it be Sinlay, Miraka, Fonterra, or you're supplying some of the meat companies, you've got assurance programs now. You've got to meet some of these requirements. Yes, they do fall back on the farmer. Absolutely. You have to be, that's right. So what we've got to do is get more for what we produce so that we can cover those costs. I don't think any one of us are pretending that there's not a cost involved in this. But to do nothing, there'll be a cost in the marketplace ultimately that undermines the value of everything we do now. Believe me, consumers who buy our products in Beijing, you think China might take everything. The people who buy our products want to know where it came from, what's the production system, and ensure that we are meeting what are expectations of consumers. And so, to answer that, we will have to share the cost. Government has considered this and is looking at ways of helping. An integrated farm plan is a template that we're looking at that will hopefully provide a simple way of farmers who may not have a plan or an assurance system to work through the process and to be able to supply their dairy company, their meat company, meet the expectations of their council, comply with health and safety regulations, make sure that we're running decent biosecurity systems on our farm, and that we can say that we've got good animal welfare practice. Because if we can't prove those things, then before long we won't be able to sell our products off the farm.
Further questions? Sarah, have you got any down the back?
Just coming now.
Yeah, Simon Johnson, Rangitata Island. Hey, we dairy farm out at on the island there, and we've been there for a while. Well, the family has. We've got a little creek that runs through our farm. It's called McKinnon's Creek, and it's a salmon spawning site. It's been measured since 2001 monthly by the regional council. If we go back to say 1996, or sorry, late 80s, early 90s, there was one dairy farm in the area. We developed it. There was another dairy farm just down the road, which ended up owning that one as well. With the rest of the area, there was pretty much dry land farming, a lot of merinos, There was feedlots in the area which people supplied dryland hay to, a bit of cropping, bit of potatoes, and pretty much reasonably extensive because a lot of it was dryland. Now, the milligrams per litre of nitrate from 2001 to today has changed from 3 to about 4. So can you please tell me, if we go and unwind all the land use changes, because at the moment it's pretty much shoulder to shoulder dairy farming from the coast almost up to the foothills. So if we go and unwind what's been done and we get back to 3 megs per litre, then what do we do? And what about those guys going broke in the meantime? So what happens there?
Right, thanks for that. I mean, a couple of things. First, that clearly shows that intensification makes a difference to your waterway, which I think we all know, but it pops up, come from the groundwater. Look, the challenge here is how do we continue to produce without doing that level of harm to our waterways? And you know, there are a range of options and ideas and systems, and I've been talking to a few people in this room who think they've got the solution. The challenge is how to create a system that can identify, bring those solutions to you, and you can still make money out of that operation. I mean, you know, the government is open to a discussion around the nitrogen attribute. I said that before. That might be one of those situations where you can actually achieve good, healthy water, you know, with a particular number, and we're open to considering how that might work in future. So yeah, I mean, it is also possible that there will need to be some land use change. That's the way things might have to be in some places.
Can I have a crack on that one too? We discussed this in draft with the various farm leaders groups, Beef and Lamb, Dairy NZ, Federated Farmers, and we said at the time to them that, or I said, and I also said on the day that we launched this, that the most curly bit in all of this is the nitrogen attribute, in my opinion. We heard in other parts of the country it might be sediment, but you know, I personally think the hardest bit is the nitrogen attribute. And we said that there will, you know, that this is a consultation about it. We followed that up in the days that followed in Parliament and in the media, saying we're up for a discussion as to whether there needs to be a regional variation in respect of that. Now, we obviously want to get, whatever the regional variation is, we want to get things on the improve rather than getting worse. And I'm serious about that. I think everyone in the room wants things to get better rather than worse. Now, what do we need to do that? Well, I don't know what all the solutions are, but I do know that that the science and innovation that comes out of the agricultural system generally both increases productivity at the same time that it increases environmental outcomes. And for me, one of the standout examples at the moment is the research that's been done around plantain. Now, we know that plantain is a high nitrogen user. We know that it causes the cows to pee more often because it's a diuretic, and therefore the urine patch is smaller, and therefore the main cause of nitrates flowing into our waterways, which is actually cow urine, it's not the fertiliser application. Now, we've got $30 million in that package to update Overseer. All of us know that Overseer is imperfect, but it's the best thing in the world. So we've got to make sure that we get the likes of plantain into Overseer so that the people that are using plantain get a benefit for it in their Overseer number, which is recognised in terms of the outputs. But there'll be others that I think this is a very important question, so I think we should give the opportunity of the other panel members here to answer this question, because I think this is at the nub of it.
Thank you. And look, I thought it was perhaps a good time to say a little bit about where that figure of 1 comes from, because of all the discussions we had in our group, that was the one that generated the most debate. Before I do that, though, a couple of things. First, about the groundwater thing. You're partly right, Brian. The package addresses groundwater only so far as groundwater in many places becomes surface water. So when we're talking about McKinnon's Creek, for example, we're talking about a spring-fed stream, and what you're seeing, the concentrations you're seeing in that stream are as much a reflection of what's happening up in the catchment as they are what's happening adjacent to the stream. So we have to recognise that, and we've recommended a lot more work on groundwater in our report. The second thing I wanted to say before I talk about nitrate is that my personal philosophy, and this is based on 35 years in this game, is that good policy needs good science, but it doesn't always follow that good science delivers, or that you get good policy out of good science. And that's not a comment on this particular package. I think what it's doing is it's saying we have to test these things. We have to test the policy. We have to test the science. And those of us who've got a science background in this room know that that's how science works. It's all about being tested. So where did the 1 come from? Well, we looked at a lot of data, and we had, when I say we, I was the non-expert on the science panel. We had me plus 15 research scientists by and large. Now, most of those scientists were either freshwater ecologists or water chemists or whatever. We were focusing on the water. We didn't have any economists, we didn't have any agronomists or social scientists or people who understood farming systems. We were just looking at the streams, okay? We had to digest a huge data set from right around the country. Data that compared nitrogen concentrations to various aspects of ecosystem health. So those are things like nitrogen and fish, nitrogen and insects and other critters living in the stream bed, nitrogen and plants and slime, and nitrogen and something we call ecosystem functioning, which is about things like respiration and decomposition. And what we found when we looked at all of that data was that in each case there was a relationship between nitrogen and that element of ecosystem health that we were looking at. So, and the data are very scattered, but by and large you could see when one goes up, the other goes up. And our task was to sort of define a point where you went from, say, good ecosystem health to sort of impact or severely impacted ecosystem health. So where did you go from moderate to severe? So what we did with all of those relationships is that they got kind of averaged out. And when you do that, you can find a point on the line, if you like, that says, okay, this is the point where you can expect to see that change happening. And that number is actually around about 0.8. And if you look at the sorts of standards that are in use overseas in places like Australia, parts of the USA, parts of the UK, you'll find that there are very similar numbers they're working off. In fact, some of them are a bit lower than that. And the old New Zealand guideline, which is Australian-New Zealand guideline that was formed in 2000, is actually about 0.4. So we're actually saying, no, we need to come up above that. The figure is around about 1. Now, the other thing you have to realise, though, is that the data are highly variable. It's not the relationships aren't really tight. So what that means is that there are some places where a figure of 1 might be a little overprotective and other places where it could even be underprotective. So that, to my mind, means we need to consider that in our policy mix. So when you're making your submissions, you might like to think about that. What does a policy look like that recognises that variability? And Minister Parker alluded to that just a few minutes ago. So that's the background to that number anyway. Sorry, it's a bit long-winded, but there you go.
Thanks, Ken. In case you didn't know, that was Ken Taylor, the chair of the Science and Technical Advisory Group.
Just 2 comments. The whole purpose of these meetings and this process is for you to submit back in and, say this is what we think needs to change to make it better. I don't think there's any doubt across Canterbury that there's a very strong feeling 1 part per million is going to change in lowland streams, which is the example we were talking about, is going to drive change that none of us want to see. So I think, number one, think about how you might not just go in and say 1 part per million is hopeless, but how in Canterbury could we manage things with perhaps some higher numbers around lowland streams, but protecting the big rivers, protecting the alpine systems, and sticking in most areas with that national standard, which is the national standard. So I'm encouraging you to, as you get together with your farmer groups and thinking about the submissions that go in, if they're individual, how might you do that? Come forward with suggestions. The other thing, Minister O'Connor won't thank me for saying this, but going back to the previous question that came from Ms Smith from the Sheep and Beef North Otago, our group actually recommended that farm plans should not be compulsory and should not be driven out of Wellington, but rather that they should be left in the hands of farmer groups and industry to drive along. They're a great tool. They're a very useful tool to get to the right outcomes, but certainly where our group landed was that they shouldn't be a sort of a nationwide compulsory thing driven out of Wellington because of some of the issues you raised, because it could well drive bureaucracy into it, and it could actually see them dumb down a bit, rather than farmers really engaging in the plan and trying to figure out what the very best thing to do is. If farmers are worried they're going to be measured against it, then they won't be quite as useful as they might be. Now, that is a difference in opinion, so I won't be thanked for saying it, but I think, again, that's something to submit on if you feel really strongly about that.
Hello, Rebecca Willens from Ashburton Lyndhurst Irrigation. I'm just trying to get my head around these rules because we've got 244 shareholders who are ringing me daily at the moment asking what this means. Earlier you touched on the interim measures. I'd read through the discussion document and it excluded some areas. Canterbury and Otago were both in the exclusions in that discussion document. I then went and had a look in the draft NES and NPS to try and see where that sat. I think I understand where that comes from, although it's not as prescriptive. I'm just wondering whether you can confirm that Canterbury and Otago are exempt from those interim measures as it says in the discussion document. I can tell you which page if that helps.
Yeah. Most likely is the answer to that. Most likely. We have to be confident. We have to be confident that those plans deal with the risk of, if you like, adding to the problem. And we just need to make sure that those plans do that. Now, they might do that for some things, like irrigation nutrients, for example. They might not do that for sediment, for example. So these controls, interim controls on land use, deal with a whole raft of potential contaminants, including E. coli, sediment, and nitrogen, phosphorus. So we haven't had the chance to go through all the fine detail and work with councils on those, but certainly in terms of nitrogen, and most likely, yes, that ECAN has already got those measures in place. It's already fixed that limit, which would mean that certain of those measures don't need to apply in the interim.
Because it's a little hard to submit on this if we don't understand what it means for us. So it would be really good if something could be put out to the Canterbury public on what that actually means, because we can't give you a valid submission if we don't know what the impact is on us in the short term. The other thing I just wanted to put out there was we've heard a lot about the science and where that's come from and the balance there. What we haven't heard and what doesn't seem to be in the paperwork is how this new national policy statement that focuses on water quality fits under the Resource Management Act. The National Policy Statement, as I understood it, needed to meet the purpose of the Act. The purpose of the Act balances cultural, economic, social and environmental outcomes. So it'd be really good to see some assessment of that too. Thank you.
Yep. That is absolutely true, that the National Policy Statement is an instrument of the RMA. I won't direct you to our 400 pages of regulatory impact statement. There is a summary version which is about 50 pages, but at least officials have advised the government that we believe this is an appropriate balance of those various outcomes that need to be achieved.
Question down the back. Sarah, please.
Yes, Greg Anderson, the sheep and beef farmer from up the top of the Fairlie Basin. I'm just like to make a comment on your figures on your nitrogen, which I think in this room's concerned about. I've been involved in the Plan Change 7 submission process, gone through it, and I've heard that many numbers, I've gone dizzy. And I think farmers are sick of it. I mean, I'll just give you some important numbers. 0.025, and that's apparently the natural level that nitrogen occurs in New Zealand waterways. Technical reports I've read on the ECAN website. 5.25, what they've suggested for our area, because it's a nitrogen hotspot, which was plucked out of the air because it's half the national standard maximum allowable drinking standard, which is 11.3, I think. The other figure we see in the documents I've read with ECAN, 6.9, which is what they say is an allowable level for good aquatic life in rivers. All of a sudden now we've got one in front of us. So I suggest every farmer in this room you submit on that figure, because I think it's just been plucked out of air, and I'd like to hear some more technical reasons why you came up with one.
Thanks for that. I mean, I think I can't answer any more than what Ken has already laid out with respect to where that figure came from. And it's not plucked out from thin air. I mean, as Ken said, there are standards in place that are used in other countries that are pretty consistent with that one figure. But by all means, submit on all of those issues.
Yeah, Jeremy Talbot, Tamika. Firstly, I wonder whether the ministers could answer, have they actually considered the Declaration of Human Rights in any of this legislation? Because Article 17 is very clear. No body, government, corporate or individual can appropriate the rights of another person's property without full and fair compensation. That's Article 17. Article 6 talks about distress and bullying, etc. as well, by officials. Jacinda Ardern has made all sorts of policy statements about taking the stress and hurt out of people. Well, so far what we've seen of this hasn't actually achieved any of that, and I think it actually is in breach of the Declaration of Human Rights. We actually have one case which is about to be accepted by them shortly. So I think you need to think very carefully about that. Another couple of points is that when we wanted to test some water, as Greg just said, we couldn't get ECAN to test local streams and waters and bits and pieces. We're very fortunate here locally. We have the only piece of native bush undisturbed for over 200 years out at Araphanua. When we did the water tests in there and the soil tests, they were exactly the same as the intensively farmed ground next door to it for 150 years. So the water wasn't absolutely pure beforehand. The water in the water holes on that land, and it's all fenced off, it's all QE2 covenant, it is absolutely excluded. It is absolutely left as it was. It's 3.5. So we're trying to achieve standards that are going to be very hard. I think no one disagrees that our water quality needs to be improved. But there are ways and means of doing it. And the first one I would suggest is when we're talking about the compliance costs. There's no money on the farm down there today. Minister O'Connor, you know that. Minister Parker, you should know it too, because there's bugger all tax being paid by the farmers as well. There's no slack in the system. What other countries have done is that when you have fulfilled your environmental obligations, such as shifting your fences and everything else, you will get an environmental credit paid to you. Now, I suggest you start thinking about that quickly. You've done so much damage to the farming environment in the last 3 weeks. Confidence is so low. Have a good hard think about what you've done and where you're going to go and what you're going to do to actually take some of the stress out and build some of the confidence back. Because the rate things are going, I think you're going to leave us in a worse position than the last time you lot were in power in the 80s.
So who's advocating for subsidies back on? Are you? There's got one. Can I just say, look, I understand the pressures out there, and there might not be a whole lot of surplus money around, although if you've got beef production, it should be all right. Horticulture's not too bad. Lamb's pretty good if you're selling to AFCO on contract. There are a number of really positive indicators out there. Can I say one of the uncertainties, I guess, is dairy? Well, can I, is wool just shot down lately? Well, bugger me. Can I say that I've got a task force on wool? Righto, that's right. If you don't want the benefits, that's fine. I'm not going to give up, and I'll keep trying. What you should have done is kept Fonterra, kept their feet to the fire. It might have helped your income. Where the hell were you then? Yeah, I am really angry. I'll tell you what, I was more angry over in Westland because I've sold their dairy company. Can I tell you, yes, there are pressures across the system, but don't blame us. Okay, what we are trying to do is to give you certainty, right? And I don't think there's anyone in the room here. Are you going to blame us? I don't know what you paid for your farm. I don't know how much your cost of production are. But I'll tell you what, there are farmers I meet around this country that can make a profit when things are really low, that have met all the environmental standards that we're talking about, that have good animal welfare standards, and they're the exemplars that we need to learn more from. Can I just say, to come back to Jeremy's point, yes, there is an obligation to one another in society. None of us has the right to pollute or to affect the environment. One of the issues rolling around in Christchurch, you might notice, is the fact they're going to have to chlorinate their water. When I lived there, one of the proudest things they spoke of was their pure artesian water. That is no longer the situation. I'm not pointing fingers, but what I'm saying is it is an issue, as we've spoken here about groundwater, that we've got to try and address over time. What we are attempting to do is to ensure that we have an upward trajectory in water quality, because we have had one moving down and we can't continue to allow that to happen. So all I'm saying, I'm aware of the pressures, but we're trying to be honest. We're trying to put a discussion document out there that allows feedback, that has flexibility for reality, but says in all honesty, we have to move up with water quality over time. Otherwise, we'll all be in a poorer, worse, and I have to say a socially disabled and destabilised community. There will have people who will be grumbling not just about chlorination of their water, but about all the other things we've talked about. We're trying to get things on track. We've had campaigns against dairy. We've had a whole lot of work going on. We're just trying to move on and build on that good work.
Thanks, Minister. We have a question down the back, please, Sarah.
Just one here.
Dave Standard from Geraldine. We fenced off our rivers, and as soon as we did, up come the broom, the gorse, the blackberry, the old man's beard, and choked out the river. No one's going to do any fishing or duck hunting or anything else. That river's just like inaccessible now. So the first flood that comes down is going to cut through the fence and rip through our properties. And has any thought gone into the fact we've got to keep these rivers clear?
Do you want to answer?
Sorry, the end of that question was, and who's going to pay for it?
Well, look, in an ideal world, you'd plant up your riparian strips and use sedges and flaxes and things like that, which tend to suppress weeds, and not only that, but they intercept overland flow, particularly of crap, and stop it getting into the waterways. So in a perfect world, that would be the long-term solution to that. And if you're worried about protecting your fences, then yeah, you'll probably need to clear that stuff. Those weeds. You can use, of course, the fencing proposals don't include sheep. So, you know, if you wanted to, you could, for not necessarily in your case because you've made the decision to put in a permanent fence by the sound of things, but you could put in a hot wire and when you've got cattle in the paddock, keep them back an average of 5 metres while you've got cattle in the paddock. And then if you are going to rotate your grazing and use sheep, then take the hot wire away. So that's another alternative you've got. Well, you know, our waterways in their kind of more natural state are pretty well shaded as a general rule, right? And temperature is important. It's important to both ecosystems and it's important to oxygen. So, you know, spraying them and exposing them to sunlight, getting them warm, encouraging periphyte and growth through increased sunlight isn't spectacularly good either. So I can't comment on what Egan's told you to do. No, that's right.
Yeah, Simon Williamson, Omarama, North Otago Feds as well. I just feel that you've taken a pretty broad brush approach in here and especially through those alpine rivers. All of the ones that I'm aware of are pristine. I don't know any that are going backwards. They've all got sheep and beef in them. They're impossible to fence, a lot of them. I just think we know that there's hot spots around the country. They need to be dealt with separately, and they are being. There's been a lot of work done in the last 10 years. Everyone in this room will attest to that. But I just think to take a broad brush approach to these things. The second part of it is you've got the nutrient issues which are the bogey in the room. And under your own admission that you haven't done the modelling yet on that, yet you're asking us to submit on this within 6 weeks. And I think that's pretty unfair until you've got the modelling. Push it out for 6 months. Get the information out there so that we know what we're talking about.
In respect of your first issue, with respect, I think that's exactly what we are doing, because that situation that you're talking about isn't impacted by these rules. In respect of the modelling issues, well, there is actually already good modelling in there around a range of scenarios for all of the interim controls. It is fair to say that the nitrate attribute can't be properly modelled until we set it, essentially. And that, as we hear, is including calls for regional variation. So it's a bit chicken and egg there, but you know, we agree that there is more modelling work as to the economics of variable nitrate attributes that needs to be done before final decisions can be taken.
Yeah, Michael Salverson.
Sorry, the question just then was, so is the Minister saying that alpine rivers don't have to be fenced? So just to clarify again on this fencing requirement, the stock exclusion. So it's not a fencing requirement, it's a stock exclusion requirement. So it may or may not be permanent, fence. Well, there are new technologies coming along all the time, right, around stock exclusion. Well, we want to, look, nobody wants to stifle innovation by saying you have to fence, and then somebody comes along with a technology that says, actually you can use a collar. You know, so you know we don't want to stifle innovation here. Okay, so just to be clear, the proposal is mapping lowland or flat and gently rolling country. We've got a few proposed slopes there, 5, 7 and 10 degrees. Doesn't make that much difference as to which areas would be covered by these mandatory rules. It won't be your property, right? In your property, what would happen is the requirement would be a farm environment plan. There would be some guidelines that a skilled operator working with you would come up with some sensible, common sense measures. And if that means it's impossible to fence, it's impossible to fence. But you might have a wetland that you can do, you know, or you might have a key critical source area that you can address, right? That's what we're proposing. No, but we are.
Yeah, Michael Salverson here. Immediate past president, Mid-Canterbury Federated Farmers, and beef and deer farmer in the foothills west of Mayfield. The biggest problem that I've got is we've been talking about this all for 10 years now. We started in the Heinz Hall in the lower catchment, but 10 years ago with these new guys, these ECAN commissioners who we'd never met before, and it was all pretty scary stuff. And the problem is then, since then, we've had national policy statements, regional plans, land and water management groups, and this, that, and the other, and the goalposts are moving every 6 months. As soon as we do something, we've discovered 6 months later, oh, we've put the fence in the wrong place, or we've done this wrong, we've done that wrong, and so on and so forth. We can never get ahead, and that's the biggest problem. So there's no certainty that if we do it right this time, it's okay today, but in 2 years' time, we're going to have to undo it and redo it.
Look, I appreciate that comment, and I think it's one of the key things here is that farmers need certainty. We know that these are issues, we know that we are going to have to do things, and we don't want those goalposts to keep shifting. And that's why I think it is important that we don't just rally against this and kick the can down the road again. We've got to find ways. In your submissions, I really encourage you to find sensible, practical ways that you can actually get to the outcome that you need, but still have viable farms. Because what you don't want is to just kick all this down the road, because it's going to come back. And it's going to keep coming back for two reasons. Number one, actually most Kiwis want us to be doing this stuff. No, they don't understand what it's like to be running a farm, and they don't understand the challenges that you face every day, but they're going to keep electing people to put pressure on us to do this until we really sort of agree, these are the things we're going to do and we're going to get on with them. That's the first point. Second thing is, don't underestimate how much the markets are pushing pressure onto us now. I'm not saying this from a political point of view. I'm saying this from sitting around the table with key customers for the last 10 years, and this has flipped. In the last 2 or 3 years, the first conversation, not the last conversation, is about these issues. And it will lock us out of markets. It will prevent us getting the top dollar in markets in future if we don't have these things nailed down, and if this conversation around New Zealand keeps getting kicked around. So I think it's really important that we do, that we don't keep doing what you're suggesting, which is sort of moving things around. Certainly our group and the advice to the team has been trying to do that. If farmers have got fences up, do not make them pull them all out and move them by a metre. Give them time to work that through. And you heard in the proposal that if there are fences in place now, even if they're not appropriate, if they're not in the right place, my understanding is there's a 15-year period to get them in the right place. All right? But those who have not put in fences against those, and your neighbour has, in areas that should be fenced, well, we've got to get on with it. We've got to do those things. And again, look, nobody, I don't think anyone's under the illusion that in your sort of situation that we should be demanding that fences go around extensive land uses and trying to fence off waterways that just, it's completely impractical, isn't going to work and isn't going to have any benefit. I think if you get into the detail of the proposal, I'm not going to guarantee there aren't things there that you should be looking for, but I'm not sure where they are. I think that really it forces, as I see it, if sheep and beef farmers are operating as intensively as dairy farmers, they should be fencing the same way as dairy farmers have. And for those in the headwaters where it's much more challenging, yes, they might, if they've got a paddock of crop next to a waterway, they need to think about how they're going to set it back, how they're going to set it up so that animals don't get in. But I don't think anyone's going to make you, fence merinos away from creeks out in the high country.
Can I just briefly comment, because it came up on the West Coast as well about submissions, and people thinking they had to read the whole report and do an analysis of what that might mean for their farm and then write an extensive submission. Look, you'll go through that and there'll be particular points you think, that's just ridiculous. We can't implement that and where I am because of the catchment you might be in. A one-page submission raising that practical point is valuable to this process. And so, don't get bogged down by what you can't understand or fully, implement in terms of what does this mean on my farm, but actually just raise the points that you think are of concern, and they will be, as I say, taken on board.
Leonie Guiney, we farm dairy cows in Fairlie, for which we don't apologise. Thank you for coming down, and to follow on from John's comment about finding ways to move forward together, I think it would be really helpful if the ministers get a clear picture of what the fear is in this room. So if I can articulate it from my perspective, our fear is we welcome consultation, but it has to be a consultative process, and I'll tell you a wee story about our own experience of it, which is why I fear what that means. We fear the absence of objective economic analysis and the impact of that on the well-being of our rural communities, right? Once we know that's going to happen and we can have the right conversation, I think you'll get a whole lot more buy-in, because we all want the same. I'm not sure we want N levels of one in our water, but we all want quality water outcomes. So, Damien, you just mentioned that there are farmers who can ride the cyclical lows with good animal husbandry, blah, blah, et cetera, and I think you've been on our farms, and I think you could define us as people like that, right? We are profitable, all right? Profitability and environmental sustainability can work together. You've seen it. You've met our award-winning staff, okay? You've presented them the awards. You've had a pie in the Fairlie Bakehouse, which has been funded by the profits from irrigated dairy farming, okay? We're still expanding that place from the profits from irrigated dairy farming. Problem is, we're as at risk of all of that being over as the guy who's not environmentally sustainable because of the process we've just been through, and I have to explain it. So we've been working, and it was most of our fellow farmers in Fairlie did more work than Kieran and I did, but 2 years we were consulting on minimum flows in the south of Pua from where we take our water, right? And it was good collaborative process, okay? All stakeholders involved, fish and game, forest and bird, all interested parties and farmers. We actually came to a collaborative arrangement to lift the minimum flows to a level that was workable, not great for the farmers, but workable for everybody. What happened was, right at the end of that process, one stakeholder, the organisation I won't mention, who had refused to engage in the whole process, then came in on top of the whole process, right at the end of the process, and has imposed numbers that are actually completely unworkable for us in 2030. So with water, it's not a linear arrangement. You can't take a bit more away and they'll just be a bit less productive, and that's okay. It's binary at a certain point where our assets that generate 3,500 EBITs per hectare would suddenly become ones that only generate $700 a hectare without water, okay? Now, if that's the case, then we can't invest anything, we can't service our debt. So the level that's been imposed on top of us now is in this Plan Change 7. And that's created an unbelievable amount of stress, and we're not even sure if we're going to put in our... We were just actually going through a planning process for more development in the Square and Fairlie, but that's dependent on profitable dairy farming, not dryland sheep farming on the Ashwick Flat. So that's the uncertainty, okay? We had good process, we engaged in good process. If people are allowed to come in over the top of that at the end of the process, that's unfair process, that's dangerous process, and that's what's killing investment and confidence. So I loved hearing the word consultative. It has to be consultative, really genuinely consultative with objective. And I know you like measurement, David. We want measurement and objective economic measurement and objective scientific measurement. And then we can work together.
Can I just say it is genuine consultation? We do understand, but we're trying to be upfront with what we're trying to achieve here. And one thing I'll say about my mate David, and you know, he's been in the firing line, he's absolutely straight and honest. And we're being straight and honest with what we're trying to do here. And in that cynical bugger there, go and meet him. I'm saying just because you don't like what he says doesn't mean to say he's absolutely committed to better environmental outcomes. We understand the pressure, absolutely. And I'm not making any excuses, neither will I stand up for any person that stands outside the system and is able to come in. The RMA reforms that David's working through hopefully will address that. The system that we've had through the consultation, that is all these different groups providing us with advice, have had all those groups in the tent. And there's been criticism of that. But they've come up with agreed advice that has been part of this proposal, this discussion document, and then we'll listen and go back. I can guarantee what we finally end up with, many of you might disagree with. That's the reality. In fact, very hard to get farmers to agree on a hell of a lot. But the thing is that we do want better water outcomes. We want to be heading in the right direction, and we want the wider community to support farmers, knowing that we're working hard, looking after your environment and producing the wealth for the country. And I know you might think that's rhetoric, but we've actually got to get back into a position where they do, and they do appreciate us, they don't understand us, but they don't want the negative environmental outcomes that they are seeing from time to time around the country.
Thanks, Minister. I'll just add one more thing on that particular circumstance that you described, and that is that the proposed new process that is in this package should help address that issue, right? Because in this proposed new process, your opportunity is up front. If once a decision is made, you know, and a recommendation comes out of the panel, and it'll be reasonably difficult to challenge, you know, to change that. That your chance is to participate in the process, not to keep your powder dry and wait and go through the Environment Court at some future point. That's what's intended.
Right, we have a question down the back.
Yeah, Mark Adams, Fairlie Sheep and Beef Farmer. One of my concerns is about the proposed moratorium on any further development and the negative effect that that'll have on our rural servicing businesses and our rural communities. Just have you really thought through what just dropping the anchor may really mean? Have you done any economic analysis? And have you sort of thought through just again wider impacts outside of market forces? Thank you.
Sure, Mr. Parker.
Yeah, we've thought carefully about that one. Interestingly, the group that was the strongest on this, there was unanimity across all the groups on this one, but the group that was strongest on this is the one that's most adversely affected by that, which is Maori landowners, because Maori landowners own an enormous amount of underdeveloped land in New Zealand. Nonetheless, they actually proposed something stricter than what we're doing. And why did they do that? Because they thought that to allow further intensification makes the clean-up difficult, takes longer, and is more expensive for everyone. So that's actually why they recommended that. Now, there is a fair criticism amongst sheep and beef, particularly, from their perspective, and they say this to us. They say that the effect of this is to grandparent the higher discharging practices of more intensive systems that are more common in dairying. This is not a criticism of dairying. This is just their view of the arithmetic. And so sheep and beef say, we don't like these interim controls because that locks in to their detriment of their land use improvements that they could do on some of their high-class lands, to their detriment, and effectively does that for the benefit of higher discharging land uses. There's no perfect solution there, and in the end, what all of the recommendatory groups came to us with is to say that the best thing is to hold the line in the meantime while you get other mechanisms in place to sort that out. Now, you heard a discussion earlier about whether farm environment plans should be voluntary or compulsory. The reason why the Ministry of Primary Industries recommends that they be compulsory is for two reasons. One, they think it'll be easier to standardise them so that we don't have lots of differences between different sectors. But also, if you're going to move from that short-term control on intensification to an alternative, you actually need farm environment plans in place, because otherwise none of the officials can see a way through to returning to something more flexible. And that's why the Ministry of Primary Industries thinks that we need to have everyone in a farm plan so that we can drop those interim controls and just move to farm environment plans.
Thanks, Minister.
Yeah, hi. Jason Grant, Federated Farmers, South Canterbury, and I farm up in Fairlie Basin. I'd just like to thank you, I'd just like to thank ministers for coming down and fronting our meeting. I really appreciate it. I've just got a couple of points. One point was a bit supplementary to Mr. Pearce's story around his deer farm and deer fencing off. I just would like you to not make the assumption that the pollution that was talked about. I mean, farmers aren't worried just about the pollution that they may well be creating. So water quality is important to us, regardless of where it's coming from. Also, another point was we've heard a lot. There's a lot of confusion around some of the proposed rules in this proposed plan, and I've also heard we need a lot more research done on environmental and the economic effects of what this plan may have on our regional economy, and also too some more some scientific research to understand the implications of some of this. So my question is that I'd like to see a 6-month consultation period for this, just so we have some more time to find out some of this information. Why is there such a rush to have this 8-week consultation period, and why, for something so important, is 6 months not too much to ask for?
This journey has had about a decade of consultation. Truly has, including all of your peak bodies involved in it. Now, we can't have every one of you in a room working through these difficult issues, but we do have representatives of every industry, really, that have been on these peak bodies. And, we've had the Land and Water Forum went for 9 years. At the end of that 9 years, Land and Water Forum put themselves into abeyance. We didn't. They put themselves into abeyance because there were a couple of issues that they couldn't crunch because of the disagreements in the room between sheep and beef and dairy, essentially. It was unfair sometimes for everyone to actually hold hands and come up with a collaborative outcome, because the different private interests that people have, all of which are proper, mean that they actually can't agree. And when that happens, it's actually the duty of government to actually look at all of this, get some more advice, and actually make some proposed decisions. So we then took that. We've had these groups running. All of their reports are here. They're all public. There's nothing hidden here. This is not some fantastic invention of the Labour Party. We've actually just reported what these recommendations are from these advisory groups, put them out for consultation. Now, is 6 weeks fair? Well, we've actually extended it to 8 weeks. 6 weeks is what we use for legislation, generally. So, we think 8 weeks is fair enough to get those reports after all of these years of background work. I would say that we will have nuggets of wisdom coming from everyone who wants to submit on their little issues, but the big, thorough submissions will come from your peak bodies. They're the organisations that you pay through your membership fees to actually, synthesise some of this stuff and put it together. And I believe that after the decade that they've been involved in these things, that they're placed to do that within that time frame.
Question down the back, please, Sarah.
Chris Allen, just a humble sheep farmer from Mid-Canterbury. I've just heard in the last half an hour at least 3 different interpretations of stock exclusion. And having been involved with it quite a bit over the last few years, even though it never got an uptake, is what are we talking about? Are we talking stock exclusion? Are we talking setbacks? Are we talking about average numbers of distance? Because I think everyone in the room wants to understand, there's a discussion document out there, talks about some average numbers. We're talking about a 360 regulation which is imposed by central government, which needs to have clear certainty, and I can't actually work out whether the people are presenting are talking the same language. So I was just wondering if you could clarify that as to what you're talking about so that everyone in this room knows what you're talking about. Even the ministers might want to comment on that as well. And the other one is, we were talking
Chris,
about...
I would have expected that you would have read the document before you said it would have been the end of farming as we know it.
That was something in the document, thank you. But okay, the other one is just if you could clarify the water being measured, if we're talking about a din of whatever that number happens to settle on, are we talking about main rivers? Are we talking about little tributaries? Are we talking about drains? Are we talking about anything more than a metre wide? That would just help everyone in the room to understand, is there a different measuring system we have to do, or are we just relying on where the water's currently measured? Thank you very much.
Thanks. So with respect to that, the issue about where the measurements need to be taken, so there is direction in the National Policy Statement that says councils need to put their monitoring regime in place in places that are representative of the catchment, right? So it needs to be representative of the water bodies. It doesn't have. Could never be every single small stream or achieved in every single small stream. We're working kind of at the more macro level than that. In terms of stock exclusion, so it's very difficult in a stand-up thing like this with so many people who want to ask questions of the ministers to go into a whole bunch of detail. What I would say is it is laid out, and the best place to find the correct answers or the exact answers are in this document here. And it's laid out in only a couple of places. You don't need to read the whole thing, I promise. There's a table at the back that lays out where stock exclusion would apply in the mapped lowland areas and what would be applied outside those areas. And then there's a description in here of proposed description of what would need to be in a farm environment plan. And putting that table and that table together and the farm environment plan will give the answer you need.
Just a couple of things. It says 5 metres on average. One of the things that we've discussed, and I'm actually pretty staunch on, is that no farmer that has a decent fence in place should have to shift it. And as John said, over 15 years, maybe you need to move to that 5 metres on average. Now, that exclusion is only one tool of a number that you need if you're working through a freshwater plan to meet the requirements that you'll meet when the decisions are made. So it's only one of them. On the West Coast, they're saying, look, we get bloody floods. The creeks get washed out. What happens? Well, there are practical realities that, of course, we acknowledge. And, it won't take a long or extensive submission to make that point and to ensure that we have a sensible proposition. That's why it's on average 5 metres. Can I just say for my mate, David, look, Chris, it's really hard. We're going out with genuine consultation, with some genuine proposals. We know they're not perfect. And there is pressure out around the farming sector. But inferring and stirring things up and putting fear in farmers' mind that they won't be able to continue to farm doesn't help any of us. That's why David reacted. We want to work with farmers to a solution that we understand why we're doing it and that we can do it on our farms. And there is a hell of a lot of negative hype out there, and some of it's just plain politics. I understand that. But getting alongside the farmers and helping them understand what we're trying to achieve here will be a lot more productive than saying that what we're proposing is the end of farming. That's why David reacted.
If you want a more specific answer, it is actually clearly there, Chris, and I would have expected that you know this, and I suspect you do. Where an existing fence does not comply with the setback requirements, it shall be allowed to remain in its current positions until 2025, unless the setback has a minimum 2 metre average width and is at least a metre wide, in which case the doesn't have to change till 2035. And then in addition to that, landowners may seek an exemption from stock exclusion requirements or an extension of the phase-in timeframes. I think that's pretty clear.
Thank you. It's me again. I think you got the impression now that we're feeling pretty stressed. And I'm a retired farmer, and I'm actually bloody pleased I'm retired. I wouldn't like to handle this. But we've got so much happening. We're in the middle of lambing, we're in the middle of calving. We have local body elections for 2 bodies down here. We've got Plan Change 7, we've got this enormous initiative, and we've got World Cup Rugby. Now, come on. We can only do so much. But I wonder, quite seriously, Ministers, whether it would be possible for you to consider to call in Plan Change 7, park it up, let us get this right, and this has to be done right because everything hangs off this. Call in Plan Change 7, get this right, get this out of the road, and then go back and we can have a look at Plan Change 7 after that. At the moment, you're asking, and you and ECAN are asking far too much of people who are already overworked and very, very busy.
Submit on it. You know, we're open to that. In terms of the new plan making process, which has its first reading next week in Parliament, which in itself will have a separate consultation process that people can submit upon it, probably 6 weeks, which is the standard for legislation. One of the issues is what do we do with transitional provisions, and those issues actually are covered in that bill, but certainly have a look at them in detail and submit on if you think those transitional provisions aren't right. On the other hand, as Leonie said, if you've been through these processes and you've actually got to outcomes that you think are just about right, you've got to be a bit careful that we don't throw all that up in the air again, and we don't want to do that. So we're trying to get that balance right, but submit on it if you don't think we have.
Thank you. Hi, Alan Newton. I'm a vegetable farmer down by the OP River. I was also involved in Horticulture New Zealand pre-2010 and sat on Lucy, which sounds a bit rough, doesn't it? But it was land use, change and intensification. So I was very amused to hear how our surface water's in trouble because the presentations we received pre-2010 of all the wells in Canterbury that have been tested, there was no change in water quality since they've been doing it, except for Phaeton by Ashburton. And of course, I thought straight away the freezing works, but no, it was from the urban swell. But that was my little political bit, but never mind. My question is to the ministers, one thing concerns us about consultation, is in South Canterbury have an OTOP committee, which is not elected, it's appointed by ECAN, and that is a committee that puts in recommendations to ECAN, whether they listen to them or not, but at least there's something that we have representing us. Recently, the Auditor General just decided that if you have a financial interest, you're not able to sit in on those meetings. So 7 of the people from the committee, if they're talking about minimum flows in the OPAHE, have to walk out. I don't think that's very democratic, as everyone's got an interest sitting on there. And my question to the ministers, did you know about it? If you did, do you think it's right? And if you don't think it's right, do you think you may approach the Auditor General, be able to put some influence to change that?
You're very sick getting here from me. You'll get sick of hearing from me soon. But I'm happy to try and answer that one. The Auditor General acts independently of us. We actually have very little influence upon them. They are exercising their discretions, which they do in accordance with their legislation, and we've done nothing to change that. In respect of a broader point, I think everyone shares responsibility in New Zealand for things not being perfect. In urban areas, where we've got a bit of pressure on them to stop all this crap getting onto the beaches in Auckland. But you have to ask yourself, why didn't councillors stop that previously? And the answer is probably because those local councillors back way back when some of the decisions they took weren't quite right. And you can say in respect of them, well, central government should have stepped in earlier because it's been going on too long, and that's fair. And you can say the same in rural areas too. We could all point the finger at everyone else and say that everyone here has got a share of the responsibility for where it's got to. And actually, that's true. And everyone also shares the responsibility of fixing it up. And we all share those responsibilities. Now, in respect of how do we sort of make sure that these sorts of things don't happen again, one of the things that the Land and Water Forum recommended was that we probably need a water commission in New Zealand. Interestingly enough, the Waitangi Tribunal just said the same thing last week or week before. If you think about this new plan-making process that we've got, that's sort of got this standing committee of experts working with local, regional people to try and sort of push things along, it's a wee bit like a water commission. It's a bit of a halfway house there. So I don't know what the long-term shape of all this stuff should be, but I think history shows that we actually haven't had it quite right in the last couple of decades. And so we've got to look at some alternatives like that. So I suspect that's the long-term answer to your question. How do we actually, and that's probably also the long-term answer to people like who are expressing concern about the way in which these rules change too often, is that we need to sort of get a better handle on that. And one of the ideas that's being promoted and will be considered by the wider RMA review, not the stuff that's before us now, is actually whether we need a water commission. A bit like in the old days when we used to have NOASCO, the National Water and Soil Conservation Authority.
Thank you, Nikki Hislop. I farm just down the road on an intensive irrigated sheep and beef property. Can everybody hear me? I guess my question and perhaps firstly statement is that you mentioned earlier about the difference of opinion perhaps between sheep and beef farmers and dairy farmers. And I think the first point I'd like to make is I think we all need to remind ourselves that we're all pastoral farmers in those two camps. And I think some of the concerns shown is for those low emitters, regardless of land use type. And so I think I would really ask the government to keep that in mind, and rather than point out those the differences between sheep and beef and dairy, because I think we want to be constructive going forward.
Look, can I absolutely take that on board? And I met with Andrew Morrison just this afternoon. We were talking about that very point, and I accept that we've not talked of grandparenting at all. What we've talked about is not wanting to add further to the burden or the impact. And so working sensibly through that is what we want to do. There will be farmers that want to intensify, and the issue of irrigation and what are the impacts, and if you have to get a consent, and I don't like the process of going to get a consent. I think we're all a bit fearful of that. But if we can, make sure that's a fair process and a reasonably, robust and rapid one, then getting consent, to put irrigation on a sheep and beef plant to grow better lambs should be sensible. If the outcome and the output at the bottom of the line is not much greater.
Time is getting on, ladies and gentlemen. So we've got 3 questions lined up down the back. I've got 4 lined up the front here. Then we're actually going to have to call it quits. The ministers have been here. I'm not sure what time you have to get away, ministers. Yeah, okay. So we're aiming to finish at 8:15, because there's industry meetings after that as well. So we'll go down to the back for one of the 3 questions, and I've got these 4 lined up the front here, and then that'll be it, unfortunately.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Alice. I'm contract milker from Geraldine. You use time and short term and interim, and yet you also stress the urgency of this issue. Have you set a deadline by which regional councils have to have set the timelines?
going to let me answer that one. So there are a number of measures that take effect immediately, right? So or that will be phased in from the start, and those are things like some of these measures around winter grazing and some measures around stock exclusion. So that's in the National Environmental Standard. In the National Policy Statement, councils would have to have their plans in place by 2025. They'd have to have a notified plan by 2023, but the government isn't laying out any particular timeframes about when those bottom lines have to be achieved. That's up to councils working with their communities to decide. I got the thumbs up. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, Jim Anderson's my name. I'm chairman of the Parirura Catchment Group. Minister Parker, quite rightly, has expressed concern about nitrates in the water, in that we know that it is a real health risk if they're high, particularly unborn children. One of the big problems for us is the inaccuracy of overseer, and I see government have put a substantial amount of money aside for improving the system. I personally believe that overseer was never designed or written for the purpose for which it's being used, and I'm sure you know that. I believe, and my colleagues believe, that overseer should be scrapped and we should start again. And I think government should put that money into funding Lincoln University and Massey to establish the science of a much improved system for establishing nitrate losses.
The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment looked into overseer recently and had a look around the world to see whether there was anything better that we could use as our starting point than overseer, and couldn't find anything. So came to the conclusion that once again, New Zealand farmers have been at the leading edge of this in the world. And that's not a surprise to me, because that's so often true through our history. So although overseer is imperfect, it's actually the best output modelling tool in the world. Most other countries actually have strict regulation of inputs. So if we were going to dump overseer and completely start again, we would effectively have to move to input controls. Now, I think that would be a worse outcome. And so I'm one that thinks we should persevere with overseer. Now it is imperfect. There's a number of things that need to be done with it. The algorithms need to be made more transparent so that scientists that have got contrary viewpoints and people who are interested in these things from an industry point of view can have a crack at them and critique them. But also we need to, in my opinion, show progress so that we can give recognition to things that are done, like I mentioned plantain before, but other people in some parts of the country to trap sediment will be using, they'll be restoring some of their wetlands and things. I think we should persevere with overseer because we don't have a alternative to it. Now, I know that Damien's going to jump up, and I'll leave this to him too, but in the end, it actually might be, in the future, there might be things that overtake overseer, and I'll let him talk about that. But in the meantime, we got to start with what we've got.
Look, I've heard over many years the criticisms of it, justifiable criticisms of overseer. The perverse outcomes around lucerne and stuff like that. But I think, David, I launched overseer as Associate Minister to Jim Sutton as a fertiliser management tool, and then it's been developed as the only tool available for regional councils. But as David said, the Commissioner for the Environment said, look, while it's the best in the world, it's not robust enough for regulatory oversight, so we are going to have to beef it up. What I have asked on a regular basis, a couple of things. Firstly, the money we're putting into overseer, could that be spent in other technology that gives us a more accurate outcome? and measurement. I don't want to go to input controls. But so take lysimeters. Now, with technology, I believe we'll be able to buy a lysimeter for a couple of $100. It'll be real-time monitoring. You'll put it in the soil in crucial parts of your farm, and you will have, you know, whether it's half hourly or whatever, like you do with water, you'll have monitoring of what might be the nitrates. Now, someone came in, put on our desk of ministers, this long lysimeter thing that you put in and said it's really good and it's real time. Look, there's a whole lot of proposals out there and technology is moving forward. We have to check it and make sure that it is credible. In the meantime, we have committed that money, quite a bit of money, to try and bring Overseer up to be a useful, credible tool for you as farmers, but also for regional councils. Because you're right, we want something that you understand the benefits of. And if there's a positive action here, then there's a positive outcome through Overseer. We've seen at different stages a positive input and a negative outcome, and people say, what the hell's going on with Overseer? So we understand the deficiencies, but the alternative of input controls is not something we want to see in this country. Yeah. Yeah, we're sure.
Question down the back.
Good evening, Ministers. Transparency on water quality. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. My name's Hugh Lee Fleming. I'm a dairy farmer in Waimiri. I would actually love to see a list of the rivers that are, well, where they are now, where they were 5 years ago, and we would like to see them in 5 years. I think there's too much cloaks and daggers going on in the dark. We never, a lot of stuff's been achieved, and David, you alluded to that, you know, progress has been made. Well, we want to see it. We want you to show us that progress. You want us to buy into it, you need to show us what we've achieved to this date. If you want us to support you with what you're trying to achieve, several times for 6 months. Give a little, you'll get a lot from us. So I'm suggesting to the ministers they need to give a little, and we'll come across, but the room has asked for 6 months for submittals. Thank you.
Ken. Look, thanks. That's a really good question. I think it's fallen to me to answer that. Yeah, we have the data that show those rivers that are improving and those that are in decline. And if you go to the MFE website and look at Environment Aotearoa, you'll actually see those trends there. But this actually, it triggered a thought in my mind when you asked that question, because, you know, we know that water quality is declining with respect to some contaminants in some places, so, you know, whether it's E. coli or nitrogen or sediment. But the one contaminant we haven't talked about tonight is phosphorus. And if you look at the results for phosphorus, you'll actually see that there are far more sites where we've got trends of improving water quality than we have of declining. And in my day job, or the job I'm paid for at AgResearch, one of the things we've been trying to do is understand why that is so. And it's a bit hard to untangle, but the answer actually lies in the things that you are doing on your farms day by day. In other words, it's the way you manage farms, it's your land use practices that are resulting in that measurable improvement. So I guess what I'm saying is that for me, there's some light at the end of this tunnel, and if we can do it with phosphorus, we can do it with the other contaminants as well.
Yes, Paula McAtimney. I'd like the Minister to share their forecasts of the change in agricultural output and the cost going today versus where you see it in 5 and 10 years, because you could not bring this to the table without knowing sort of where you see agricultural output and as a carrot and a stick sort of approach. If the room bought into this, then the government actually pay some of that change as the costs are going to be extreme and the stocking rates are going to go down. So it's really how much are the farmers going to lose, and that should be shared by the whole of New Zealand, not just the farmers.
I was share milking in 84 and 85, and I attended the protest rallies in Addington when the Labor government took the subsidies off. And it was pretty hard on individuals, I have to say. And I think at about that time we had 70 million sheep. And we've got less than 30 now, and there's more sheep meat going out of our country. If I'd said that in 1985, that we're going to maintain the level of production, no one would have believed me. I don't think we should underestimate the ability of New Zealand farmers to continually innovate and adapt and move forward with the challenges, whether it be a drought or floods, or whether it be new technology, new breeding schemes. That's what's made us successful. It is very hard, as I say, to try and assess the total quantum of the effect, because there are some farmers, quite a lot of farmers, who are meeting most of the standards that we'll expect. And for them, it won't be a cost. Will it affect their production? Not quite sure.
I don't think many people will be at one. And the timing of this whole event is right on the back of the US government report on nitrate causing tumours in the Medicare health system over there, which I believe he can have the full report, and I can't help thinking what it's really about is addressing our health issues.
I mean, there's emerging, knowledge around these things, and I should refer to someone else. I'm the last person that should be talking about it. Other than to say that, look, we're trying to do this in a way that gives you certainty, that allows you the ability to adapt and the tools to adapt. We don't have a bottom line on that. But I'd pretty much project that its total production probably won't change much because we're so bloody good. And I'm not saying we're the best, but we're bloody good at adapting. I won't say there will not be impact on individual farmers. It wouldn't be naive enough to think that. But there's a lot of really good people out there that we should learn more from.
I can't say that better, but I can give you an assurance that this isn't being driven out of what you say in respect of the United States. I can give you that assurance because that hasn't been any of the advice stream that we've been getting from these groups that have led to this.
This is the final question for the evening.
G'day, Gareth from Timaru Farm Beef. We've got an irrigation scheme, got a consent to take water, we've got a command area, so we've got all the consents in place. We still have, say, 2,000 shares to sell, and a lot of that water will go to farmers that won't intensify that much. It'll be for drought protection. Is that in the moratorium, or do we stop selling those shares now?
Good thing to submit upon. My expectation is that if something's got a resource consent already, that it would be it wouldn't be caught by those intensification rules. So that example might, but talk to officials and we can clarify that, and that's certainly an important issue for you to submit upon.
Ministers, John, Ken and Brian especially, thank you for your answers to the questions. And thank you all to everyone that's asked questions here this evening. The key messages here, we need to get our submissions in. I'm putting my own in as a sheep and beef farmer, and I'm also putting one as a member of our local catchment group. It is vital. We have to trust what we've told, that our submissions are going to be listened to and read. So I encourage you all, whether it's a one-pager or whether it's 40 pages, please get your submissions in, because we have to have our say. This is such an important issue for everybody. In closing this meeting, I'd just like to point out there's some resources around the room. So there's resources at this front table here, and there's 2 lots of tables down the back. So grab that information, because everything you need to know is somewhere in there, and it's a good opportunity. If you don't like reading online, it's really good to have a hard copy. Again, I just thank you all for turning out this evening. It's a busy time of the year, and remind you that there is industry meetings after this, Beef and Lamb, Dairy NZ and Federated Farmers. Is there someone from one of those organisations that would just like to outline how that's going to happen, would like to come up? Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, so as David said, yeah, so we're just going to have a bit of a meeting with Dairy NZ, Beef and Lamb and Federated Farmers. It's going to be all about you, providing us a bit of feedback on where you think we need to be heading with submissions, and just to hear some of the feedback that in addition to what we've had today. So I think we would probably like to kick it off about 8:30. Do you want to? Is that going to be okay? That'd be fine. Yeah. So yeah, if you're welcome to stay around, and more the merrier. And yeah, we'll kick it off at 8:30. Thanks.